Hello, I am very, very pleased to welcome you to this latest issue of Radio Corona. I am Gideon Litchfield, the editor-in-chief of MIT Technology Review, and I'm talking to Vince Cerf, Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, one of the people with the title Father of the Internet, as the co-creator of the TCP/IP protocol, along with Bob Kahn. And Vint is also someone who had and has recovered from COVID-19. Vint, we are very, very happy to have you with us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I've always looked forward to these kinds of events, so let's have at it.
Great. So let's start by talking about COVID-19. We have one of our listeners who's on this call is someone who sent in a question who apparently was born in the same year as you, 1943, and went on a tour of some former Soviet states with you in 2010. Unfortunately, I didn't get this person's name, but they asked if you could talk about your experience with COVID as someone of that generation, and how was it? How was it for you, and was it did you do anything in particular to take care of yourself, since we know that it affects older people disproportionately?
So first of all, my wife and I had traveled to London 3 times at the beginning of this year, once in January, February, and March for about a week to 10 days each. So we were in London from the 3rd to the 9th of March. We returned on the 3rd to the 12th of March. We returned on the 12th with no symptoms or anything like that. But a few days later, on the 17th, I started demonstrating or showing symptoms. I had fever, 102.4. I had a mild headache. I was coughing, but it was a light cough. And so it was pretty clear that this sure sounded like COVID-19. That evening, I went through the chills and pretty severe chills. Didn't chip any teeth, but it was scary. And the reason it was so scary, of course, is that you have no idea what the course of the disease is going to be. You've heard all these scary stories about people, falling off the deep end, ending up being intubated and dying. And I'm in the 76-year-old frame, and so I'm also at risk. More so than perhaps younger people, although I should point out that we're now discovering that this disease has some side effects that were not obvious even in March, among which are included things like stroke in younger people. So this is a really nasty critter. I was lucky, though. The symptoms were basically mild. I recovered from the basic symptomology and then basically was just tired. And so it took about 3 weeks, frankly, to get back to a reasonable level of energy. Normally, I travel 80% of my time. I'm not traveling at all right now. Google has us working at home, and you're not supposed to travel anyway, except for necessity. So I have not yet tested my energy level against my usual 80% travel time rate. So I don't know, where am I relative to that. But at the moment, feeling normal. Anyway, with good energy levels. I think the scariest part about all this was the psychological part of not knowing if it was going to get worse, and imagining all the bad things that could happen, and having no clarity as to that. The other thing, which still persists as an issue, is not knowing whether I have any immunity.
Right.
It's very. I mean, I had tests done. Probably a couple of days after it was very clear, 2 or 3 days after it was very clear that I had something that sure looked like COVID-19. It was very hard to get a test. We called 2 doctors. We live in McLean, Virginia. There's an adjacent county, Arlington County, and they refused to allow us to come and be tested because we weren't residents of the county. So that pissed me off. Then the Fairfax County health people said, well, we can't do the test. And I said, why can't you do the test? And we don't have any protective equipment, so we don't want our medical people to be exposed, blah, blah, blah. So that didn't work. Finally, we paid $500 each to get tested in a clinic in Washington, D.C. And a few days later, we got back the confirming diagnosis that we had COVID-19. So what this tells me, and is probably telling everybody else, is that a great deal of our daily infrastructure is dependent on people being able to go to work. And we shut all that down because this particular virus is propagatable, human to human through the atmosphere. It doesn't require some other kind of intermediate vector. So what I learned out of all this is how fragile our infrastructure is in general, not just the healthcare system, but everything else that depends on people being able to work together in proximity to each other. So I'm looking at this from a very, very different perspective than I ever did before. We have had other illnesses, but we haven't had, except for September 1918, I don't think we've had a widespread, rapidly propagating, and potentially fatal disease like this confront virtually the entire global population. And it puts a bright spotlight on our interdependencies on a global scale, supply chains and everything else, plus our deep dependency on our ability to literally all of us go to work. So we've been very lucky, those of us who can work at home, who, sitting here with laptops and other things, heavily dependent on internet, which is the topic we'll be discussing a bit more. So this has highlighted a great many different things for me and suggests a great deal of thinking, planning, and work is ahead of us to try to be better prepared for this kind of situation in the future, which will surely come, whether it's repeats of this particular virus or whether it's an evolution of that virus into something else. We will have this problem again, and we should be better prepared for it.
I mean, it's really striking also how different the experience of being in it today must be from how it might have been if the virus had struck 10 years ago or even only 5 years ago in terms of our ability to be connected. I mean, when you were co-creating the TCP/IP protocol in, I think it was 73, 74, you could not have imagined, presumably, that
no
video calls all the time.
No. I knew about the 1918 influenza. My wife lost family members in that 1918 influenza. One was a doctor who went off in the morning to help people and died that evening. So we were aware of that, but I certainly didn't have that at top of mind as we were developing internet. In fact, everybody should know that it was a Defense Department initiative to build capability for command and control.
Right.
And that, by the way, in those years included voice and video as well as data, as opposed to the conventional command and control voice-based system historically, or message-based. There were combinations of those two things. This was really an ambitious effort to use computer-based communication, computer-mediated communication, including voice and video and data. And so we worked on that part pretty early on. We were doing experiments with packet voice and packet video in the late 70s and early 80s. But nonetheless, we didn't have the capacity to do the kinds of things that we're doing today, which is something we should discuss because it's clear that we may need even more capacity in the future.
Yeah. By the way, before we go on, so a note to the audience, if you are watching, please do send in questions for Vint via the chat or by the comments on YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitch, wherever you're watching, and I will endeavor to ask Vint as many of them as possible. And then I have a request for Vint. Your microphone is, I think, maybe brushing on your sleeve or something like that.
It's on my coat. Is there a problem?
It sounds like somebody's eating celery in the background every time you touch the fabric of your coat.
Well, I've been trying to keep from is it making clothing noise?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. Well, it fell off, and so I had to put it back on again. Now I'm not touching it. Are we still okay?
We're good.
All right. That's good. Thank you.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the uses of technology to fight against COVID. Obviously, Google and Apple have created this framework for other people to build contact tracing apps on. And you've also built in some safeguards like banning the use of location tracking, banning the use of the data for anything else other than contact tracing. So these obviously address some people's concerns about privacy. Do you think people have a right to be worried about the privacy of how this data is being used?
Generally speaking, yes, especially if we were tracking location specifically, as opposed to simply tracking that you had been in proximity to something else. In some ways, it doesn't matter where you were in proximity as much as it does that you were in proximity with some random identifier. And so the information that we need in order to, I'm not, by the way, responsible for writing the code, so I don't know any of the details. I don't want to misrepresent anything. But the primary mechanism here is to know that two random identifiers, which change over time, have been in some proximity to each other within Bluetooth range, and to capture that information as to the time. Maybe not even necessarily location, but just the time at which that happened. The idea being to help you be alerted if someone else willingly made use of this same app, and then so that the tracking of identifiers is being done. If any one of the people who's using the app then reports afterwards that they have to or that they have contracted the disease, if they're willing to say that, then you get an alert saying someone that you were in proximity of has reported positive COVID-19. And that tells you should go get tested.
Right. Several people have also in the audience sent in questions about misinformation and how it's spreading during this pandemic. You said in the past you're not in favor of tighter laws on what people can share online. I mean, you told New Scientist in an interview last year, we have to figure out how to handle that without turning the internet into an authoritarian environment where people don't feel free to express themselves. And yet we're seeing that misinformation is very dangerous. I mean, it's probably literally causing people to kill themselves right now. So what do you think is the solution?
So, well, I wish that I had a simple little, so let me just tear open the envelope. Here's the solution. By the way, misinformation and disinformation can be a problem in the tracking thing too. What if somebody deliberately announces that they have the virus? Then in a sense, they're sending a signal to people who have not actually been exposed, to tell them that they have been. That triggers all kinds of things, anxiety, rush to get tested, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So none of these things are perfect. They very much rely on human beings behaving reasonably. And I've been fond of pointing out that we're still reading Shakespeare 400 years after he wrote his plays, because the people haven't changed in those 400 years, probably haven't changed in 4,000 years, as to their motivation. And of course, Shakespeare shows us all the bad motivations that people are capable of exhibiting. Let me set that aside for a moment. I've been thinking a lot about why it is that misinformation and disinformation propagates so rapidly in the social networking environment. And one of the things that you probably would agree is that a warning is something that we pay a lot of attention to, because it's telling us something bad will happen if we don't pay attention. And that's probably partly evolutionary. I mean, let me give a silly example. It's X number of hundreds of thousands of years ago, and our deep, deep ancestor paid no attention to the fact there was a saber-toothed tiger over there, or maybe they weren't contemporary with humans, but pick your favorite beast. If you didn't pay any attention, you didn't contribute to the gene pool, because you got destroyed. So warning is something we probably have evolved into being highly sensitive to. That's one of the reasons that warnings and scary kinds of stories propagate so quickly, because people have become conditioned to tell other people there's a big problem, there's something you should be worried about, something you should do something about, something you should change your behavior about. And so that's my homegrown estimate for why it is that misinformation and disinformation of the scary warning kind propagates so quickly.
Right.
Now, we have a big problem in helping people figure out what information they should reject and what information they should accept. And for a long time, I thought that maybe critical thinking would help us, that if people who are willing to apply the kind of scientific method that says, what are the sources of information? Are they validated or corroborated by any other sources? All the kinds of things we normally do when we're trying to work our way through the either the proof or refutation of a scientific theory. I'm being told that that's hard work and not everybody's willing to do it. And so that may not be the solution to the problem. It could be that the best that we can do is to try to draw people's attention to information which by some means or other we believe comes from valid and credible sources. But in the end, it's each person has to decide what they're going to accept and what they're going to reject.
So you don't think that the platforms like Google, Facebook, and others need to be doing more? I mean, it's already happening that, you know.
Well, we're
taking down misinformation, right?
Well, clearly, Google and others are being, Facebook and Twitter and so on, are being either asked or told that they have to remove bad information by some definition of bad, for which, you know, very little detail is offered. And so there are terms of service that all of us introduce to try to reduce the level of misinformation and disinformation without doing too much damage to freedom of speech. This is a very hard problem, because who should decide what should be taken out, what should be removed? And I don't think it's reasonable to imagine that the platforms will be able to do that job perfectly. And so we're back to the individuals who make use of these platforms to use their heads, which is, you know, it's like God gave us brains, so we should use them.
Well, again, it's back to either the platforms, or the individuals using them, or it's governments telling platforms what they can put up there. So what you're saying is it's down to the individual. And I think some people have got a different view of that.
Well, there are some regimes, of course, that take it on themselves to dictate to the platforms exactly what they can and can't do. And that, of course, for those of us who are accustomed to Western freedom, that doesn't look like a very attractive proposition, because now we have full up censorship. So there must be some place in between where we find a way of helping people discover good quality information and then decide for themselves what they accept and reject.
Right. I mean, some people would say that place in between is Europe. So at the moment you have, both in the handling of information and also in the handling of people's data, you have three sort of broad regulatory approaches emerging. And this is actually something that I want to come to with you. But, you know, in China, the government dictates what you can see, and it controls your data. In the US, broadly speaking, nobody dictates what you can see, and the private sector controls your data. And in Europe, the government is trying to have certain controls over what you can see, and also trying to return more control over people's data to them, to the individuals. So, you know, but I know that also Google has been pushing back against a lot of the regulation that the European Union wants to impose. But do you not think that Europe could be somewhere middle ground?
Well, let's ask ourselves what it is that we're trying to achieve in all of these cases. I think the motivations are not the same in the three cases that you just offered. The most stark difference, of course, is the authoritarian regime that wants to control what its population is able to say and able to get access to. The most extreme case on the other side is everybody gets to say whatever they want. Then the question is, if there is harm in each of those extremes, where do we find a balance between protecting people from harm that they are unable for some reason to protect themselves from? And that's, I think the Europeans are trying to find that balance. I'm not sure I agree with all of the choices that they've made, but I do think that we have to accept I would prefer that we accept the idea that human beings are capable of thinking for themselves. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to allow them to be exposed to every possible source of misinformation and disinformation, because there's clear harm associated with that. So telling people that you should drink bleach in order to kill COVID-19 is harmful. I mean, it's palpably harmful. And you might ask yourself, how would anybody do that? Or why would they do that? Or why would they even believe that? But I would suggest to you, if you look at any electrical appliances, you will typically see a long list of please don't sit in the bathtub with the hairdryer plugged in, because people have actually done that and they have been sued for product liability.
Right.
So it may very well be that the liability space is the place where the control will show up. How much liability is associated with allowing this freedom to speak? How much liability can you shield someone from because you're trying to foster that same freedom?
I feel like it should be possible to say that people are capable of thinking for themselves, and also that people are capable of being manipulated. And, I mean, the algorithms that social media platforms in particular use to decide what content to show you, that has a manipulative effect. It can influence what sort of content people see, and also then what decisions they take. So isn't there, again, you have to, I don't think the two ideas are contradictory.
No, they're not. But I will tell you that let me add one other element in this discussion, something I've become more, have come to appreciate more recently. There's a book by a guy named Sapolsky at Stanford called Behave. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of other books. The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt is another one. There are a number of books that try to help us understand how we think, and also how we don't think, how we react, how emotion colors our thinking, our logical thinking. This has to do with trying to help people to reject bad information. Turns out it's hard. And it doesn't work, for example, to say to somebody, this information is false and you shouldn't believe it. Because if they're comfortable with it, they're going to say, well, you think I'm stupid, or, you're wrong and I'm right, as I want to be comfortable not admitting that I was wrong. Mm-hmm. We discovered that that repeating the false information and saying it's wrong doesn't work.
Right.
The one thing that I'm just learning about is that people don't like to be manipulated. And if you can show them that they have been manipulated without necessarily blaming them for that, that may turn out to be the strongest way in which you can help someone avoid being harmed by misinformation and disinformation. But this is a delicate thing. This is not a simple matter of an algorithm. It's not a matter of writing a law, liability, or anything else. It's understanding the way people think, how they think, and the way their brains work.
Oh, so that's interesting. So what are some ways in which you can show people they've been manipulated without making them feel like it was their fault?
Well, particularly you want to be sympathetic to this. I mean, you could go about it by saying, boy, are you stupid, you've been manipulated. A different side of it is, you could even say, I had the same problem, or here are other people who have had the same problem. You're not alone. You are a target. Many other people have been a target. Here's how this works. This is why you should know about that.
Right. Coming up to another event this year, obviously the US election, and the misinformation question looms large there too. You gave some testimony, I think, in the UK to Parliament there a little while ago, and they were proposing, I believe, some sort of common criterion for how platforms handle political ad targeting. And you indicated you might not be entirely against it. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how that might help solve the problem?
Well, part of the question is providing people with more information about where information comes from. And in the case of political elections, because they have such significance, the parliamentary system is a little different from ours. In the parliamentary system, you can throw the bums out. You can actually cause an election to happen at almost any time. Hereas in the American system, we do this on a schedule, and if you're not happy,
change that. It's now with the UK as well.
This may or may not be a good. It could be a bad thing if you have too many cycles of elections. Or if you looked at Italy and France in the 70s or something, you'd see the other side of this story. But the point I want to make is that knowing the source of information that is specifically aimed for a particular candidate, for instance, is pretty important. And so I think the platforms that offer political advertising are now also saying, as we do for television and radio, a requirement that the source of that political advertising be cited and validated.
Right. So going back to something we said earlier, one of the challenges I think that's emerging now for the internet is you're seeing different regulatory regimes emerge as more and more countries try to adopt laws about data and about the internet. which obviously makes it difficult for global companies to operate because they have to satisfy a whole bunch of conditions. How do you see this developing? Do you think we will end up with some set of global standards, or is it going to become increasingly fragmented? And what will that mean for, well, for companies like Google, but for anyone who's trying to do a global internet business?
To be quite honest with you, I think that we are already there in a fairly fragmented sense. I think the rules are national in character. Google and other multinational companies are forced to try to adopt mechanisms that will allow them to adapt to the whatever constraints and requirements are enacted on a national basis. And so this is up in the application space. I think a lot of the companies, mine included, have had to adapt the applications to be more sensitive to local conditions, which is why, for example, you have google.fr and google.uk and google.de, so that we know which regime we're responding to as we offer services to people who are logged into those services.
Right. One of the things that obviously would help a lot in fighting the pandemic is having better.
I think my microphone fell off again. Sorry. So much for duct tape.
Sorry. So one of the things that would help us with the pandemic is having a better global picture of the data, not just number of cases and number of deaths, but really granular data at every level on how much testing is being done, what the infection rates are. But it seems like we suffer, not both at a global level and also within the US, from this very fragmented form of data collection. Do you see any way in which that could get fixed?
Well, that's a very good question, and I hope the answer is yes, to be quite honest with you. The more reasonable heads try to explain to the population and to policymakers that in the absence of good quality data uniformly collected and analyzed, in the absence of that information, the harder it is going to be to make any kind of predictions to set policy that is protective of everyone's safety and health. That's the logical argument. There are people, I suppose, who must have some reason for not wanting to allow that collaborative and more uniform data collection to happen. I can't understand why, frankly, and we were talking about the potential for people dying in this case. So I hope that more logical heads prevail. There are also a bunch of other elements that go into this. It's not just about the data itself. It's how do you get the data? Well, you have to be able to test for it. How valid are the tests? How good are the tests? How inaccurate are they? What do they tell you? Example, I've had COVID-19. So I had a PCR test that said you had the RNA was present in your system. That's pretty strong confirmation. But if I go back now and get an antibody test, it will say, yeah, you must have had the disease because now you see antibodies. But we don't have any idea whether that confers any immunity or what level of immunity or what duration of immunity. So the information is close to useless, except possibly for helping us figure out how widespread has the infection become. Mm-hmm. So I mean, these are examples of how hard it is to get the information we actually need in order to do any kind of projections, to make decisions about opening or closing the way the economy works. We really, really are desperate for better data.
Correct. I want to come on to a question now about the digital divide. So in some sense, your job as chief internet evangelist is about closing the digital divide, because you're all about getting the internet to places where it doesn't exist yet, where people don't have it. And one of the ways I think in which we're seeing the digital divide emerge now is with the emergence of more and more kids doing homeschooling.
Yeah.
We're seeing that the kids from richer communities and richer schools are having a better time of it and better able to learn online than the poorer ones, and that's risking exacerbating the divide that already existed. Do you think this is So first of all, do you think this is a technology problem or is it something else?
Oh, it's certainly partly a technology problem, but it's economic. It's expressed in economic terms. How much does it cost to get the equipment? How much does it cost to get the service? Is the service adequate for purpose? Is it high enough capacity to allow people to continue learning from home? Can all the family members make use of their network and access to the internet to do everything that they want to do? Streaming videos, going interactive conversations like the one we're having, attending classes and the like. And the problem is not just rural versus urban. We have urban areas that have poor quality internet as well as rural areas that have poor quality as well. So there's a great deal of investment to be made to close that gap, whether it's the actual internet service itself, or it's the equipment that's needed in order to take advantage of it, or it's the training that's needed and the kinds of applications that are needed in order to make it useful for various purposes. Now, we're already, I guess, discovering remarkably that the internet, at least here in the US, has managed to meet the demand largely for this suddenly increased amount of learning and working at home. But it's certainly not uniformly meeting that demand, and there are places where it does not adequately. That's another thing we don't have, by the way, and that's good data. We have information about where the internet is supposed to be from the suppliers of the service, but the way in which it's measured is sometimes, how shall I say this, uh, inadequate to the question. For example, if one person in a congressional district or a census district has high-speed access, some of the reporting implies everyone in that district has high-speed access, and that may not be the case. And so there's a real need for better data. Ironically, the need for data on internet access and utility is in parallel with the need for better data about COVID-19 and its spread. So there's work to be done to get better data, to make use of that, figure out where we should be investing in infrastructure. But I want to emphasize, and I thank you for the way you asked the question, that there is more to this than just making it possible for someone to get access to the internet. We have to make sure it does useful things, has locally useful information, and think about the parents who are trying to pretend to be teachers with their kids at home. None of them were prepared for that, except for the few that were doing homeschooling anyway. Thank you very much. So this particular pandemic has highlighted a great deal of, let's say, missing capacity, not in bits per second, but in capability to respond under the conditions that we're now forced to operate in.
Right. One of our listeners, someone called Brian, was asking about the role of nonprofits in all of this, because there are nonprofits that are working on trying to close the digital divide, but they, like everybody else, are being hit in their budgets. The funding is vanishing. So what do you think? Should the private sector be doing more to try to close this, or help nonprofits do it?
So this is a very interesting question, because I pushed very hard for private sector to engage in offering commercial internet service, even though many of my research colleagues said, what do you mean, you want to let the unwashed masses into our sandbox? But I thought it wouldn't be self-sustaining, and it could not expand to individual use and private sector use unless there was a real economic engine supporting it. So sustainability, which is a very popular word these days, is very important for all of this. It's not a matter of just the capital investment to get more equipment out there and get more towers and investment in 5G or whatever, or more fiber, but it's also the ability to run a business that's sustainable, that has a real business model that works. There is some suggestion that we should think of this as being such an important need that we should look at other situations that we have where we have responded. So, for example, if people are in a very low income level, we've offered food stamps. We have the earned income tax, where you actually, if your income is below a certain level, you actually get paid by the government instead of the other way around. Maybe we should be thinking about subsidies. Maybe we should be thinking about ways in which we can use some of the FCC's universal service mechanisms and lifeline mechanisms to underwrite some of the costs, especially where we know it would be expensive to provide it. So in the rural parts of the country, doing a fiber network could be pretty tough, could be very expensive. Maybe we should be thinking about how to shift some of the burden of cost. Those are all things that we've done in other realms, and it doesn't seem unreasonable to think about it in this context as well.
Right. Let's start talking about the future, and we have a few minutes left. So you've expressed some concerns about some of the things that are the technologies that are now on the rise, like Internet of Things devices, 5G. I think your concerns are about security, basically. So tell us a bit about that. What are you worried about, and how do we make the future internet safer?
Well, first of all, when we speak of safe internet, I would like to suggest to the audience that I'm thinking not just of the underlying basic packet switching system, but all of the applications, all of the devices that are internet enabled. So we're talking the data centers and everything else. So we're talking about the full range of things that sit on top of the basic underlying internet. Strong authentication is your friend here. Strong cryptography is your friend here. Adequate key distribution is your friend. Defense against attacks against operating systems. Better operating systems that don't have weaknesses that can be exploited. Better software tools for developing software that doesn't have bugs that are exploitable. We need, the academic and research community owes it to everyone to concentrate harder on solving some of those problems so that we can feel and actually be safer. Here it goes again. And actually be safer in the internet environment than we are today. So I think that's a huge challenge for all of the software and hardware engineers that might be listening to this program.
I mean, you tried, I think, to build encryption into the early protocols. And if I understood rightly, the NSA basically didn't want that kind of technology in the hands of the unwashed masses, as you put it. So do you feel like we're now compensating for that inability to bake security in?
Well, actually, a lot of the security problems are not to do with cryptography at all. They have to do with software that has bugs that's exploitable independent of the quality of the crypto. And of course, with everybody, there are people who say, oh God, I'm really worried about quantum computing. It's going to wipe out the current crypto capabilities. I can tell you that the National Institutes of Standards and Technology is way ahead of you. They've already got 36 proposals for algorithms that are not subject to Shor's algorithm and quantum attack. They'll winnow that down to a smaller number, of course. So I don't mean to sound Pollyanna, but I'm pretty confident that there are mathematics, lattice-based mathematics, for example, that will overcome that particular challenge. The more important thing is this argument about backdoors, which we had once before with the Clipper chip back in '92. We should not allow people to convince us that backdoors are a friend, because those backdoors will be opened by bad guys and then nobody will be safe.
Right. So I'm going to wrap up with one more question. With your 50 years of hindsight about the internet, what are some things that you predict that we will be doing? I won't make you predict 50 years ahead, but let's say 10 or 15 years ahead.
Actually, I'd much prefer 50 because I'll be dead by then, and people won't, I won't be embarrassed by being wrong.
Whatever you want to predict.
Well, anyway, for sure, we will be using an extension of the internet in space. As many of your listeners will know, I've been working on this with a team at JPL and more generally at the NASA labs since 1998. We have an operational, or let me say an operating interplanetary internet now linking Earth and Mars and the International Space Station. Those same protocols will be in use for the return to the moon, at least in the US program. It's an internationally standardized thing, so the other space agencies are participant in it. So certainly over the next decade, we will see the expansion of internet capability to interplanetary applications for manned and robotic space exploration. So that's one thing. The second thing, I think, is the devices that we will either wear or maybe even have inserted in our bodies. The sort of the extreme cases of IoT that will all have a lot to do with internet access. And finally, implants and things of that kind will also end up having internet-related capabilities. My wife has 2 cochlear implants, for example, and I've been threatening to reprogram her speech processor to include TCP/IP so that when she speaks a question, it goes into the Google Assistant, and then the answer comes back inside her implant in her head. So nobody will hear the answer, just her.
Right, so that you don't have to answer the question for her. You can do it.
Right.
All right, well, that is all we have time for. Vint, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Not at all. It's a real pleasure. I hope that your audience appreciated it. I'm sorry we couldn't answer everybody's questions, but maybe there'll be other times in the future.
I hope so. And if you've been watching on the stream, thank you very much for joining us. You can follow us and see the video of this broadcast on technologyreview.com and come back there to find out about future episodes. Thank you very much.